Gloria asked us to each read a little bit from one of our publications, and then to talk to you especially about the process of writing, and especially the dissertation, and also to kind of think about what some of the stumbling blocks are that we experience and how we get through them. So, you know, kind of really hands-on practicum. So I'm just going to read a little bit from my book, and I'm passing it around so you can look at, you know, what it looks like. You know, if you take a look at the table of contents, you'll see that the way it's organized is not necessarily very straightforward. In fact, it's very poetic, and I'll talk a little bit about that maybe later, because, you know, part of what I want to point out is that there are very different ways of writing, even within academia, very different kinds of styles of writing. So let me just read a teensy-tiny bit from Chicana Art, The Politics of Spiritual and Aesthetic Alterities. And the word alterity is a neologism, kind of a marriage between altars and alterity, which really captures the idea of how the book is structured like an altar, and also how the work that I'm looking at, which is different kinds of artistic practices, but also different kinds of spiritual practices. So I'm looking at cultural and aesthetic hybridity. And so Alterities really kind of captures that, I think. So I begin, it's 7 chapters, and the first one is called Invocation, Ofrenda, which means offering. And the epigraph is from Leonard Cohen's song, The Future. And I think that really captures a lot about the writing process, in my opinion. And these are the verses. Ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. The seed of this book was planted in the early 1990s when I observed to a friend that a well-meaning scholar had attempted to be inclusive in her recounting the history of feminist theory by discussing the work of a Chicana feminist writer, but had effaced, remarkably, one of the most salient characteristics of the writer's work, its insistence on the importance of the spiritual. This consignment of the spiritual to the intellectual borderlands typical of well-lettered and political activist circles was, I argued, a patronizing act of kindness, particularly given that the Chicana writer in question had baldly declared her belief in spiritual essences, even impiously declaring that she knew things older than Freud. The suggestion that she was getting such information from somewhere other than bibliographic or experimental research was a challenge perhaps viewed as an embarrassing intellectual faux pas best ignored. My friend's response that I write about this was met with an "I don't think so," that expressed my sense of the matter as a minefield. But eventually my resistance gave way to fascination, and what initially felt like dangerous intellectual ground became a spontaneous attraction and then a passionate pursuit, as I increasingly came to note the presence of the spiritual in post-60s work to which I was drawn, and its absence in scholarly discussions of that work, and the more general marginalization of the spiritual in mainstream art and scholarship of this period, outside of its historic areas of study in sociology, anthropology, and theology. When I began this research in the mid-90s, I found the concern with the spiritual in the work of many Chicana artists quite striking, given its absolute absence in my own intellectual milieu, and in many fields of interest in which I read, scholarly and otherwise, because it seemed that the only progressives actively trying to take spirituality seriously sold their spirit-channeled, Shaktipat-inspired, and goddess-oriented revelations in New Age bookstores. I began a closeted investigation of the spiritual literature produced in the post-65 period, and earlier quote-unquote classics that had been read by that generation. Though I read many a book I'm glad to have forgotten, and others I wish I could, truly, it seemed nonetheless that this broad spectrum of writings expressed a spiritual longing in what was felt to be an increasingly duplicitous and materialist culture and an endangered natural environment. These religiously unorthodox and in many cases non-Western identified readings enabled me to begin to approach the culturally hybrid, often do-it-yourself, non-institutional spiritualities that I was seeing in many California and Southwest area based Chicana artists, literary, visual, and performance arts as a gesture of yearning, and ofrenda, or offering, toward greater personal integrity, empowerment, and social justice. So, you know, clearly I could go on. It's already written, right? But I think that's kind of enough. You know, it's also, I think it's a nice example maybe of how to start, you know, just by telling the story of how the project came about. And that's also true in the dissertation. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to shift right now, and I'll come back to my book and to actually show you the first journal in which I began composing that. Right now I'll just give you a tantalizing, right, glimpse at it. So I think that some of the things I want to say, you know, I was actually very fortunate last semester. I offered a dissertation writing workshop for the graduate students in comparative ethnic studies. It was, so, you know, I have a lot of things very fresh in my mind about, you know, how to get through the writing process, and had to reflect a lot on, you know, the different kinds of writing that we do. So I guess that's one of the, I think, one of the things I want to begin with is pointing out, of course, there are many different kinds of writing, right? But I think what we don't often think of is how those different kinds of writing can also enter into the kind of work that we do. And of course, I think it really varies by discipline, but even as I look in many different disciplines, I'm centered in the arts. But even when I look at different kinds of works that are coming out of the social sciences, I'm thinking of, for example, Avery Gordon's, right, book on hauntings, right, and the sociological imagination. I mean, there's a real effort, I think, for certainly since the second half of the 80s, scholars in different disciplines have been really at work kind of rethinking and unthinking disciplinarity because of their contact with the kinds of critiques that post-structuralism has made, and the kinds of critiques about disciplinarity that have come from gender, feminist, and people of color, you know, thought as well. So the question of structure and how we, and what it is that we're performing in the way that we write and the way that we speak, I think is a really important thing to think about, right? And one of the ways to, you know, I think to think about that has to do with what it is, what are our goals in the type of writing that we're doing. So I think that if part of what you're interested in doing is in part a rethinking or even a critique of some aspect of disciplinarity, then it makes a lot of sense to think about what we're performing, right, when we write, you know. How is it that what do we create, what kind of experience, what type of engagement? These types of questions, I think, help us to think about what ways of writing will we make use of, you know, how creative will we be in the structuring of our chapters, you know, of course, provided that our dialogue with, you know, your dialogue with your advisors, you know, goes well, right? But I mean, my point is to defend having a vision and a project to propose, you know, to your directors as to how to structure your creature, right? And what types of chapters make sense. So just to give you a concrete example, so I'm drawing on three different book-length experiences for you. I wrote a dissertation that was not this book. It was a very different animal. The goal, so what kind of writing was that, right? The goal of that piece of writing was to address a lacuna that was missing in Latin American literary and visual thought about the historical avant-garde, the first 4 decades, you know, the era of Picasso, etc. So in Latin American literary thought, there was a great deal of thinking and writing around Mexico and around the Southern Cone, but very little around Central America and the Caribbean. At that time, in the 80s, which is when I did both my undergrad and my grad, those were very openly considered backwaters. But it certainly was not the case. There were all kinds of fascinating things. So the project there was to fill a void of missing information. It was very historical in character. And in that process, what I discovered is that my literary avant-garde was super active in a variety of different kinds of projects, including beginning a neo-fascist youth group. And they were very, they considered themselves very instrumental in trying to create support for the Somoza dictatorship. They really thought that was an important, you know, thing to do. So that led me to create a type of a structure that looked at many different kinds of practices and not just literature. It gave rise to a cultural studies project that looked at many types of locations as cultural projects. That was part of what unified them. They were all practices from a common view, but simply different media. So it's quite, for me, a wonderful project.